entire town stood frozen. No one spoke, not when the elegant black carriage stopped in front of the largest ranch in the valley, not when a tall man stepped down wearing a perfectly tailored coat, polished boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. The ranch owner smiled with confidence. He assumed another wealthy investor had arrived to negotiate cattle prices. But the smile disappeared the moment the stranger slowly lifted his head. An elderly ranch hand gasped. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers and shattered against the wooden porch. "No, it can't be," another man whispered. "That's Ethan Walker, the same Ethan Walker they had mocked, the same young cowboy who had been thrown off this very land 20 years earlier with nothing but a worn saddle, an exhausted horse, and a promise that he would one day return." Back then, no one believed him. Some laughed in his face, others told him he would die before reaching the next town. Even the woman who had once sworn she believed in him turned away, convinced he was finished. But today, everything had changed. The expensive carriage wasn't rented. It belonged to him. The dozens of riders behind him weren't bodyguards, they were employees. The documents inside the leather briefcase weren't business proposals, they were ownership papers. In less than 1 hour, every acre surrounding that ranch would legally belong to Ethan Walker. The very men who had celebrated his downfall were about to discover that the poorest cowboy in the valley had become the richest landowner for hundreds of miles. But money wasn't the real reason he had come back. There was something buried beneath that land, something worth far more than gold, and before the sun disappeared behind the western hills, the truth, hidden for 2 decades, would finally be revealed. Long before Ethan Walker returned in that elegant carriage, he was just another hard-working cowboy with calloused hands, sunburned skin, and a dream that seemed as wide as the western horizon. Welcome to our channel, where every story from the Old West reminds us that courage, honor, and perseverance can outlast even the harshest deserts. If you enjoy emotional Western stories filled with justice, redemption, and unforgettable characters, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next adventure. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? We love seeing people from different cities, states, and countries joining us around the campfire to hear another tale from the Old West. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine the smell of fresh-cut hay, the sound of horses crossing a wooden bridge at sunrise, and the endless prairie stretching farther than the eye can see. That was the world Ethan Walker called home, at least, until everything he loved was taken from him. Some people believe life is decided by luck. Others believe powerful families always win, but Ethan believed something much simpler. He believed that a person's word was worth more than money. That belief would eventually cost him everything. As you listen to today's story, think about this question. If someone stole everything you had worked your entire life to build, would you seek revenge? Or would you choose to rebuild your life? From nothing, let us know your answer in the comments before we continue. It will be interesting to see how different people would respond. What happened to Ethan wasn't just unfair, it was carefully planned. There were lies, forged documents, broken promises, and one decision made by a powerful man that changed Ethan's future forever. For years, the people of Dry Creek believed they knew the whole story. They thought Ethan had failed because he was weak, because he wasn't smart enough, because he simply couldn't survive in the unforgiving West. But they had only heard one side. Today, you're about to hear the truth, a story of betrayal, relentless determination, and a promise that refused to die no matter how many years passed. So settle in, because we're riding back 20 years, to the morning when a young cowboy woke up believing it would be just another ordinary day, not realizing it would become the day he lost everything. 20 years before the black carriage rolled back into Dry Creek, Ethan Walker lived a life that many cowboys quietly admired. His ranch wasn't the largest in the valley. It wasn't filled with endless herds of cattle or luxurious buildings that impressed wealthy visitors. In truth, it was a modest piece of land resting between two gentle hills, where a small creek flowed year-round and cottonwood trees offered shade during the hottest afternoons. But to Ethan, it was priceless. Every fence post had been raised by his own hands. Every stable beam carried the marks of countless hours of hard work. Every acre reminded him of the promise he had made years earlier, to build an honest life through determination instead of shortcuts. The people of Dry Creek often noticed something unusual about him. No matter how difficult the season became, Ethan was rarely seen complaining. When drought threatened neighboring ranches, he worked longer hours. When storms damaged fences, he repaired not only his own, but often helped his neighbors rebuild theirs as well. If an elderly rancher lost a horse, Ethan would spend hours searching the hills without expecting anything in return. If a traveler arrived hungry, there was always a warm meal waiting at his table. He believed generosity wasn't measured by how much a man owned. It was measured by what he was willing to share. Because of that, many respected him. Others quietly envied him. One man in particular watched Ethan's growing reputation with increasing resentment. Harold Grayson owned the largest ranch in the county. His cattle stretched across miles of open prairie. His wealth allowed him to influence merchants, bankers, and even local officials. People greeted Harold with polite smiles whenever he rode through town. But those smiles were born from fear, not admiration. Harold had spent years buying neighboring properties whenever families faced hard times. Some sold willingly. Others felt they had no choice. Little by little, his land expanded until only one ranch interrupted his dream of controlling the entire valley. Ethan's. Unlike others, Ethan never seemed intimidated by Harold's money or influence. Whenever they crossed paths, Ethan tipped his hat respectfully. Nothing more, nothing less. He refused to flatter wealthy men simply because they were wealthy. That quiet confidence irritated Harold more than insults ever could. One crisp autumn morning, the two men met at the livestock auction. Harold slowly walked around Ethan's horses, inspecting them with folded arms. "They're fine animals," Harold admitted. "They deserve better land." Ethan smiled politely. "They already have the best land they could ask for." Harold chuckled. "Everything has a price, son." Ethan looked across the valley before answering. "Maybe. But not everything is for sale." Several ranchers nearby exchanged nervous glances. They knew Harold wasn't used to hearing the word no. The wealthy rancher stepped closer. "If you change your mind." "I won't." Harold's smile remained, but his eyes turned cold. "You'll regret being stubborn." Ethan simply nodded, gathered his horses, and continued his work. He had no idea those few words would echo through the next 20 years of his life. That evening, he rode home beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and crimson. The ranch looked peaceful. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney. His faithful horse grazed near the creek. For a brief moment, Ethan felt something every hard-working cowboy hopes to find: contentment. He didn't dream of becoming rich. He didn't crave fame. He only wanted to protect the life he had built with honesty. As darkness settled over the valley, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars slowly appear above the prairie. He couldn't see the rider approaching from the distant hills. Hidden beneath a long coat, the stranger carried a leather satchel tightly strapped to his saddle. Inside were documents, maps, official seals, and a plan carefully prepared over many months. A plan that, if successful, would strip Ethan Walker of everything he owned without firing a single bullet. The rider never stopped at Ethan's ranch. Instead, he continued toward Harold Grayson's estate, where lights still burned late into the night. Behind those closed doors, a secret meeting was about to begin, and before the next sunrise, the first move against Ethan Walker would already be in motion. Before we continue, we'd love to hear from you. If you were in Ethan's place, would you have accepted Harold's offer to sell the ranch? Or would you have stood your ground no matter the consequences? Tell us in the comments. While Ethan Walker sat peacefully on his porch, believing another honest day had come to an end, a very different gathering was taking place across the valley. Harold Grayson's mansion was brightly lit despite the late hour. The large dining room, usually reserved for celebrations and wealthy guests, had been transformed into a private meeting chamber. Heavy curtains covered every window. The doors were locked from the inside. Only 3 men sat around the polished oak table: Harold Grayson, Edwin Mercer, the president of Dry Creek Bank, and Thomas Whitmore, the county's most influential attorney. Each of them had built a reputation that appeared respectable on the surface. Harold was known as the county's most successful rancher. Mercer was praised as the banker who helped families finance their dreams. Whitmore was considered a brilliant legal mind, but behind those carefully maintained reputations lay something far darker. For years, the 3 men had quietly worked together whenever an opportunity presented itself: a struggling ranch, family buried in debt, an elderly landowner without heirs. The pattern was always the same: a questionable loan, a legal technicality, a enforced sale, and another piece of land added to Harold's growing empire. Most victims never realized they had been manipulated until it was too late. But Ethan Walker was different. He had no debts, no overdue taxes, no unpaid contracts. His ranch had been built honestly, making him almost impossible to pressure through legal means. Almost. Harold poured 3 glasses of whiskey before breaking the silence. I offered him more money than that ranch is worth. Mercer gave a faint smile, and he refused. Harold nodded. He actually believes principles are more valuable than profit. Whitmore slowly opened the leather satchel brought by the mysterious redoubt. Inside were survey maps, old property records, and several official-looking documents bearing county seals. He carefully spread them across the table. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "if we can't buy the land, we'll make the law believe it never belonged to him." Mercer leaned forward. "You've tested the paperwork." Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "Twice. The signatures are convincing. The land survey has been altered, and according to these records, the northern boundary of Ethan's ranch overlaps property Harold legally purchased 15 years ago." Harold's expression finally softened into a satisfied smile. "Meaning?" Whitmore tapped one document with a single finger. "Meaning that once these papers reach the county office, Ethan will appear to be occupying land that doesn't legally belong to him." Mercer chuckled. "And once he's accused of fraud, the bank freezes his accounts." Harold finished the sentence. "The court orders his removal." Whitmore nodded. "And by the time anyone questions the paperwork, the ranch will already belong to you." Silence filled the room, not because the plan seemed risky, because it seemed almost perfect. Still, Mercer hesitated. "What about Sheriff Collins?" The sheriff had earned a reputation for fairness. He wasn't easily influenced by wealthy men. Harold dismissed the concern with a wave of his. "And the sheriff only enforces court orders. He doesn't write them." Whitmore smiled. "And judges trust documents. They don't investigate every signature." Harold stood and walked toward the large window, overlooking the valley. Far in the distance, tiny lantern lights flickered from Ethan's modest ranch. "By this time next week," Harold said quietly, "that land will finally be mine." None of the 3 men noticed the ranch hand standing outside the stable. An older employee named Samuel had been delivering fresh horses when fragments of the conversation reached his ears through an open window. He couldn't hear every detail, but he heard enough. "False records, remove him to the ranch." Samuel's heart began pounding. He had known Ethan since he was a young cowboy. He knew the man would never steal land or forge documents. Something terrible was being planned. Without making a sound, Samuel quietly led his horse away from the mansion. He intended to ride straight to Ethan before sunrise, but fate had other plans. As he disappeared into the darkness, One of Harold's guards noticed movement near the barn. The guard narrowed his eyes. "Someone's out there." Harold immediately turned. "Find out who it was." Within seconds, armed riders mounted their horses and galloped into the night. Samuel urged his aging horse faster than ever before. The moonlight barely illuminated the winding trail ahead. Behind him, the sound of pounding hooves grew louder with every passing minute. He wasn't simply racing through the darkness anymore. He was racing against a conspiracy powerful enough to destroy an innocent man's life. And if he failed to reach Ethan before dawn, the first blow in Harold Grayson's plan would land exactly as intended. What do you think Samuel should do? Would you stop to hide and protect yourself, or keep riding to warn Ethan no matter the danger? Share your answer in the comments. Samuel had spent nearly 40 years riding the trails around Dry Creek. He knew every creek crossing, every rocky pass, every shortcut hidden between the hills. But that night, none of his experience seemed enough. The pounding hooves behind him grew louder with each passing minute. He dared not look back. His old horse, Dusty, was breathing hard, its chest rising and falling with desperate effort. Samuel leaned forward in the saddle and whispered, "Just a little farther, old friend. We're almost there." He wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about the danger. He was thinking about Ethan Walker, the young rancher deserved. The truth before the law came knocking on his door. As the moon disappeared behind thick clouds, the trail grew darker. Samuel guided Dusty toward a narrow ravine, hoping the twisting path would slow the riders behind him. For a brief moment, the sound of pursuit faded. He allowed himself a single breath of relief. Then a rifle shot echoed through the valley. The bullet struck a boulder just inches from Dusty's front legs, sending fragments of stone flying. The frightened horse stumbled but somehow regained its footing. "They're trying to stop me," Samuel muttered. "No. They're trying to make sure Ethan never hears the truth." Behind him, Harold's foreman shouted, "Don't let him reach Walker's ranch." The riders spread out across the hills, cutting off every obvious route. Samuel knew he couldn't outrun younger horses forever. So he made a risky decision. Instead of following the main trail, he turned sharply into an old cattle path that few people even remembered. Branches slapped against his coat. Loose rocks slid beneath. Dusty's hooves. Twice the horse nearly lost its footing, but little by little, the sounds of pursuit began to fade again. When the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, Samuel finally spotted the familiar windmill standing beside Ethan's ranch. He had made it, or so he thought. As he rode into the clearing, another sight stole the hope from his heart. 3 wagons stood in front of Ethan's house. Several mounted deputies waited nearby, a black carriage bearing the county seal had already arrived, and standing beside it, with an official document in his hand, was Judge Benjamin Carter. Samuel's face turned pale. "I'm too late." At that same moment, Ethan stepped out onto the porch, carrying his morning coffee. He smiled politely, assuming the visitors had business to discuss. "Judge Carter," he called. "This is an early visit." The judge's expression remained solemn. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call." Mr. Walker, a deputy, unfolded a document and began reading aloud. "By order of the County Court of Dry Creek, this property is hereby declared to be under unlawful occupation, pending immediate transfer of ownership." Ethan frowned. "There must be some mistake. I own this ranch. I have every deed, Harold." Grayson slowly rode into the yard, accompanied by his attorney, Thomas Whitmore. He removed his gloves with deliberate calm. "I'm afraid the records tell a different story." Whitmore handed a stack of documents to the judge. "These surveys prove that Mr. Walker has occupied land belonging to Mr. Grayson for years." Ethan took the papers, scanning them in disbelief. The county seals looked genuine. The signatures appeared authentic. Even the boundary lines had been redrawn. "This isn't possible," Ethan said. "These papers are false." Whitmore shrugged. "Then I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to prove that someday," Samuel finally reached the yard, nearly falling from his exhausted horse. "Don't sign anything," he shouted. "It's all a trap!" Every head turned toward him. Harold's eyes narrowed. Samuel pointed directly at Whitmore. "I heard them. They planned this last night. They forged the records." A murmur spread among the gathered ranchers, who had begun arriving to witness the commotion. For the first time, doubt crossed Judge Carter's face. He looked from Samuel to Harold, then back to the documents in his hands. For a heartbeat, it seemed the truth might prevail. But before Samuel could say another word, Harold's foreman stepped forward. "That old man is confused," he declared loudly. "He's been rambling for months." Another man quickly added, "Everyone knows Samuel isn't reliable anymore." Several paid witnesses nodded in agreement. Samuel stared at them in disbelief. They were lying. Judge Carter hesitated. Then he lowered his eyes to the documents once more. "I cannot ignore official records based on verbal accusations. Alone." His voice was heavy. "Mr. Walker, you are ordered to leave this property immediately." The words struck Ethan harder than any bullet ever. "Oh, good." He looked across the land he had built with his own hands, the barn, the fences, the creek, the porch where he had watched countless sunsets, everything he loved, everything he had worked for, not gone with a single sentence as the deputies stepped forward to enforce the order. Ethan slowly removed his hat. He looked directly at Harold Grayson. There was no hatred in his eyes, only quiet determination. "You may take my ranch today," he said, "but you will never take my name." Harold smiled, believing he had won. He had no idea that those words would one day become the beginning of his own downfall. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you have fought the deputies and risked everything, or walked away with your dignity and searched for justice another way? Let us know in the comments. The silence that followed the judge's order felt heavier than the weight of the mountains surrounding Dry Creek. No one moved. The deputies stood with their hands resting on their belts, waiting. The gathered ranchers lowered their eyes, unwilling to witness what was about to happen. Only Harold Grayson remained perfectly still, wearing the faint smile of a man convinced that victory belonged to him forever. Ethan Walker looked around one last time. His gaze lingered on the weathered barn he had repaired countless times, on the windmill whose creaking blades had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, on the creek where he had watered every horse that had ever passed through his ranch. Every corner of the property held a memory, not of wealth, but of honest work. Slowly, he walked into the house. No deputy followed him. Even they seemed to understand that a man deserved a few final moments inside the home he was being forced to leave. The cabin was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the simple wooden table where Ethan had shared meals with friends and weary travelers. He ran his hand across its rough surface. Then he picked up only a few belongings: a worn leather saddle, a blanket, a coffee tin, an old pocket watch that had belonged to his father, and a faded photograph tucked inside a Bible. He left everything else behind: furniture, tools, supplies, even the rocking chair on the porch. Material things could be taken. His character could not. When Ethan stepped back outside, several townspeople watched in complete silence. An elderly woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. A blacksmith removed his hat as Ethan passed. No one dared challenge Harold openly. But many already sensed that something about this eviction felt deeply wrong. Samuel, still exhausted from his desperate ride, approached Ethan. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I wasn't fast enough." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on the old man's shoulder. "You risked your life trying to help me. That's more than anyone could ask." Samuel looked down. "They've taken everything." Ethan glanced once more at the ranch. "No, they've taken land. Everything that truly matters is still here." He placed a hand over his heart. Those words stayed with Samuel for the rest of his life. Ethan mounted his faithful horse. Before riding away, he turned toward the crowd. "I hold no anger toward any honest person standing here today. I know many of you are afraid, and I don't blame you. But remember this: the truth has a strange way of surviving. Even when buried, without another word, he tipped his hat and began riding west. No parade, no farewell, only the quiet sound of hoofbeats fading into the open prairie. The following months became the hardest Ethan had ever known. Jobs were scarce. Harold Grayson had quietly spread rumors that Ethan had stolen land and forged legal records. Many ranch owners believed the lies. Some refused to hire him. Others feared doing business with someone carrying such accusations. There were days when Ethan earned only enough money for a single meal. Some nights he slept beneath the stars with nothing but his blanket and saddle. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Cold winds swept across the plains. His boots wore thin. His gloves tore apart. More than once, hunger tempted him to abandon the values he had always defended. A dishonest man offered him easy money transporting stolen cattle. Another suggested helping rob supply wagons crossing the territory. Each offer promised quick wealth. Each required abandoning his principles. Ethan refused every single one. "If I lose my honesty," he told himself one freezing night beside a tiny campfire, "then Harold truly wins." Weeks turned into months. Months became years. Little by little, people outside Dry Creek began noticing something remarkable about Ethan. He worked harder than anyone else. He never cheated a customer. He always honored a handshake. If someone hired him for 3 days, he often stayed 4 just to finish the work properly. Ranchers began requesting him by name. Merchants trusted him with larger responsibilities. Stagecoach companies hired him to lead difficult cattle drives through dangerous territory. His reputation spread farther every year. Not because he sought recognition, because trust cannot be purchased. It must be earned. One spring afternoon, after completing a long cattle drive, an aging businessman named William Ashcroft watched Ethan settle every account down to the last penny. "You know," Ashcroft said thoughtfully, "I've spent my entire life looking for honest men. They're surprisingly rare." Ethan smiled. "My father used to say honesty costs very little." Ashcroft chuckled. "No, it costs everything. And that's exactly why so few people can afford it." Those words marked the beginning of a friendship that would completely change Ethan's future. Ashcroft saw something others overlooked: not a poor cowboy, not a disgraced rancher, but a man whose integrity could never be stolen. Within a few short years, Ethan would receive an opportunity unlike anything he had ever imagined, an opportunity that would open the door to unimaginable success, and eventually lead him back to Dry Creek. Not as the broken cowboy who had left with a saddle and a blanket, but as the wealthiest landowner anyone in the county had ever seen. If you've enjoyed Ethan's journey so far, tell us in the comments, do. You believe honesty always pays off in the end, even if it takes years? We'd love to hear your thoughts. 20 years passed like the changing seasons across the western plains. The young cowboy, who had once ridden away from Dry Creek with little more than a saddle and a blanket, had become a man known across several states for one simple reason: his word. After William Ashcroft offered Ethan a partnership in expanding cattle routes and purchasing neglected ranches, Ethan treated every investment the same way he had treated his first small ranch, with patience, honesty, and relentless hard work. While others chased quick fortunes, Ethan built lasting ones. He never forced a family to sell. He never took advantage of those facing difficult times. In fact, many ranchers who had nearly lost everything were given a second chance because Ethan believed people deserved opportunities, not exploitation. Year after year, his reputation grew. Banks trusted him. Railroad companies sought his business. Merchants competed for his contracts. Before long, Ethan Walker owned more land than anyone had imagined possible. Yet despite all his success, there was one place he never forgot: Dry Creek, not because of the ranch, because of the promise he had made the day he rode away. The truth has a strange way of surviving. Now, that day had finally come. When Ethan's elegant carriage rolled into town, nearly everyone recognized him before he spoke a single word. The years had added silver to his hair and quiet confidence to his face, but his eyes were exactly the same. Calm, steady, honest. Harold Grayson, however, looked nothing like the powerful rancher Ethan remembered. Years of greed had taken their toll. Several bad investments, prolonged droughts, and enormous debts had slowly weakened his empire. To keep his ranch, Harold had borrowed heavily from banks, convinced that one more profitable season would restore his fortune. It never came. What Harold didn't know was that Ethan had quietly purchased every one of those outstanding loans through perfectly legal business transactions, without threatening anyone, without forging documents, without breaking a single law. When Harold welcomed Ethan into his office, he forced a confident smile. "I heard you've done well for yourself." Ethan nodded politely. "I've been fortunate." Harold leaned back. "So, what brings the richest rancher in the territory back to this forgotten town?" Instead of answering, Ethan calmly placed a leather folder on the desk. Harold opened it. His face slowly lost all color. Inside were legal notices, debt transfers, ownership records. Every document carried official county seals. This can't be." Ethan looked directly at him. "It can. And it is. You owe more money than this ranch is worth." Harold's hands began to tremble. "You bought my debts? I bought business agreements, the same way you once tried to buy my future." Silence filled the room. For the first time in decades, Harold understood exactly how powerless another man could feel. But Ethan wasn't finished. He reached into the folder once more and removed another stack of papers. Older papers, carefully preserved, the original property surveys, signed affidavits, letters, and one remarkable document Samuel had secretly protected for 20 years before his passing. It contained notes written by Thomas Whitmore himself, proof that the ranch boundaries had been altered before reaching the county office. When state investigators examined the evidence months earlier, they uncovered everything: the forged surveys, the falsified signatures, the bribed officials, even Mercer and Whitmore's hidden financial records. The conspiracy that had stolen Ethan's ranch finally collapsed under the weight of the truth. Harold lowered his head. "I never thought anyone would find it." "You were right," Ethan replied softly. "I didn't. The truth found us." A week later, nearly the entire town gathered outside the courthouse. Judge Benjamin Carter, now much older, stepped forward before the crowd. "I owe this man an apology." He turned toward Ethan. "Years ago, I trusted documents more than character. I should have looked deeper." Ethan simply extended his hand. "We all make decisions with the knowledge we have." The elderly judge shook it, grateful beyond words. Then came the moment no one expected. Harold. Grayson stood alone outside the ranch he had, spent his entire life trying to control everything. Was gone. His empire, his influence, his pride. Ethan approached him quietly. Harold whispered, "So, are you here to enjoy watching me lose everything?" Ethan looked across the valley where the wind gently moved through the tall grass. "No, I already know what losing everything feels like." Harold couldn't meet his eyes. Ethan continued, "Didn't come back for revenge. I came back for justice." Then he handed Harold a folded document. Confused, Harold opened it. His eyes widened. It was a modest deed to a small piece of grazing land several counties away. Enough for a fresh start. Nothing extravagant. Nothing humiliating. Just enough. Harold stared in disbelief. "Why?" Ethan answered with the lesson that had guided his entire life. "Because if I became the kind of man you were, then everything I suffered would have been meaningless." Harold's shoulders collapsed. For the first time in decades, he had no words. Years later, travelers passing through Dry Creek often asked about the beautiful ranch overlooking the valley. The locals would smile and tell them the same story, not about the richest rancher, not about the biggest landowner, but about a cowboy who lost everything except his integrity, and in the end, that proved to be the greatest wealth of all. Every town in the Old West had stories about gunslingers, outlaws, and treasure, but the stories people remembered the longest were rarely about the fastest draw. They were about ordinary men and women who refused to surrender their values when life became unfair. Ethan Walker reminds us that success built on honesty may take longer to arrive, but it lasts far longer than success built on deception. Sometimes justice comes quickly, sometimes it takes years, but character is something no dishonest person can ever steal. If this story touched you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was Ethan's greatest victory, becoming the richest man in the county, or refusing to let bitterness change who he was? Share your answer in the comments. We read as many as we can, and if you enjoy heartfelt Old West stories about courage, redemption, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey across the American frontier. Until next time, keep your word, stand by your principles, and remember, a person's greatest wealth is not the land they own, but the honor they carry wherever they go.